"They will not eat, your grace." The words spoken by the housekeeper, Mrs. Gable, were not an accusation. They were a statement of fact, as cold and unyielding as the marble floors of Blackwood Manor. For Duke Alaric Beaumont, they were also the tolling of a bell that had been ringing incessantly for 6 agonizing months, ever since the storm, the river, and the death of his wife, his Duchess, Eleanor. He stood by the long dining table, a vast expanse of polished mahogany that reflected the grey, unforgiving light of a late autumn afternoon. The table was set for 3 small, untouched plates, 2 silver cups of milk filmed over, a single slice of toast, cold and hard. It was a monument to failure. His failure. "Nothing at all?" Alaric asked, his voice a low rasp. It felt unused, a relic from a time when this house had known laughter. Master Julian pushed the plate away. Miss Ilara turned her head and would not look at it, Mrs. Gable reported, her hands clasped tightly before her. She had served this house for 40 years, had seen Alaric born, but now she looked at him with a pity he could not bear. "It is the grief, your grace. It has taken root in them." Grief. Alaric was drowning in it, a cold black ocean that filled his lungs and weighted his limbs. But his children, his 5-year-old twins, were not just drowning. They were vanishing, wasting away before his eyes, their small faces growing thinner, their eyes larger and haunted. They were a living testament to his loss, a constant, jewel-toned echo of the woman he had failed to protect. They had been inseparable from their mother. Eleanor had been the sun around which their small worlds revolved. Her scent, her touch, the soft cadence of her voice reading stories in the nursery. Now she was gone. Swept away in a flooded river during a sudden, violent storm while her carriage attempted a crossing. No body had been recovered from the churning muddy water, just a single sodden glove found snagged on a branch 2 miles downstream. It was enough. It had to be. His mother, the Dowager Duchess Isolde, had managed everything with chilling efficiency. The memorials, the consolations, the quiet packing away of Eleanor's things, an act of erasure that had felt like a second death. She insisted it was for the best, to move forward. But the house had not moved forward, it had stopped. The clock still ticked, the fires were still lit, but the heart of Blackwood Manor had been ripped out, and his children refused to eat. Not for the succession of expensive chefs he hired from London, not for the jellies and custards and tiny-shaped sandwiches. They ate just enough to cling to life, a few spoonfuls of broth here, a bite of dry biscuit there, forced upon them by a desperate nanny. But they were fading. The doctor had been blunt. They were starving themselves not with intent, but with a sorrow so profound it had stolen their appetites. "There is one more applicant for the cook's position," Mrs. Gable said, her voice pulling him from the mire of his thoughts. "She arrived this morning, a woman from a village to the south. Her references are modest, but she seems capable." Alaric ran a hand over his face. He was so tired. The hope he'd felt with each new chef had long since curdled into weary cynicism. What difference would one more make? Fine. Hire her. Offer her whatever she wants. Just try. He could not bring himself to say more. He could not voice the desperate, pathetic plea that clawed at his throat. "Please, make my children eat." He retreated to his study, a room paneled in dark wood and lined with books he no longer read. The air was thick with the scent of old leather and his own despair. He poured a brandy, the amber liquid doing nothing to warm the ice in his veins. Through the tall window, he watched the weak sun disappear behind the skeletal fingers of the ancient oaks that gave the estate its name. The day was ending, and his children were a little closer to disappearing entirely. He closed his eyes, and the only image that came to him was Eleanor's face, not smiling as she had in life, but pale and gasping, pulled beneath the dark water. He was a duke, a man of immense power and wealth, and he was helpless. The next morning, something changed. It was not a sound. The house remained entombed in its oppressive silence. It was a smell. Faint at first, then growing, it crept under the door of his study, wound its way up the grand staircase, and slipped into the very fabric of the house. It was the scent of baking bread, not the bland, airy loaves of the London chefs, but something rich and warm and alive. It smelled of yeast and honey, of hearth and home. It was a scent that did not belong in this mausoleum. Alaric found himself standing, drawn out of his chair by a force he didn't understand. He walked into the great hall, the aroma stronger here. It was a ghost of a memory, a feeling of warmth he hadn't experienced in half a year. And then he heard it. A sound so foreign it made the hair on his arms stand up, the patter of small running feet. Julian and Dilara appeared at the top of the staircase. They were still in their nightshirts, their hair uncombed. But their faces, usually so listless and pale, were animated. Their noses were twitching, like little rabbits. They did not look at him. Their eyes were fixed on the hallway that led towards the kitchens. Slowly, hand in hand, they began to descend the stairs. They moved with a purpose Alaric had not seen in them since the day their world had ended. He held his breath, terrified that any movement from him would break the spell. They reached the bottom of the stairs and without hesitation turned and walked, then trotted, down the long, cold corridor towards the source of the scent. Alaric followed, his heart pounding a frantic, painful rhythm against his ribs. He felt like a man witnessing a miracle, a thaw after a killing frost. He stayed several paces behind them, a silent observer. The twins stopped at the kitchen door. It was slightly ajar. The scent that poured from it was intoxicating, a thick, golden wave of warmth and life. Julian, always the bolder of the two, pushed the door open. Ilara clung to his nightshirt, peering around him. The kitchens at Blackwood were cavernous, a world of copper pots and stone floors. In the center of it all stood a woman. She was turned away from them, her back to the door, kneading dough on a large floured wooden board. She was of average height, her brown hair pinned up in a simple, severe bun. She wore a plain gray dress, the clothes of a servant. Nothing about her was remarkable, but the bread she was making. It was the source of the magic. Several loaves were already cooling on a rack, their crusts a deep, burnished gold. Julian took a hesitant step into the room. "Please," he said, his voice a small, rusty thing. The woman froze. Her hands stopped their rhythmic pushing and folding. For a long moment, she did not move, her entire body rigid. Then, slowly, she turned. Alaric's breath caught in his throat. Her face was thinner than he remembered, the elegant softness of her features sharpened by hardship. There were new lines around her eyes, and a weariness in her posture that had never been there before. Her hands, dusted with flour, were chapped and red. But it was her. The eyes that met his were the same. A deep, impossible blue, now wide with shock and terror. It was Eleanor, his wife, the woman he had mourned for 6 months. The woman he had buried in the cold, empty tomb of his memory. She was standing in his kitchen, dressed as a cook, her hands covered in flour. The brandy glass he hadn't realized he was still holding slipped from his fingers and shattered on the stone floor. The sound broke the spell. Eleanor's eyes, which had been locked on his, flickered down to the children. A strangled sound escaped her lips, a sob of pure, undiluted agony. Ilara let go of her brother's nightshirt and took a step forward. She lifted her small hand and pointed. "Mama," she whispered, the word a question, a prayer. Eleanor crumpled. She did not faint. She simply folded in on herself, sinking to her knees on the cold stone floor, her flour-dusted hands covering her face as a storm of sobs racked her body. Julian and Ilara ran to her. They didn't speak. They just burrowed into her, their small arms wrapping around her neck, their faces pressing into her shoulders. They clung to her as if she were the only solid thing in a world that had dissolved around them. Alaric stood rooted to the spot, his mind a maelstrom of confusion, shock, and a dawning, horrifying rage. She was alive. All this time, she had been alive. The grief, the despair, the slow wasting of his children. It had all been a lie, a nightmare from which he was just now waking. He took a step forward, then another. His shadow fell over the tableau on the floor, the weeping mother, the clinging children. "Eleanor?" His voice was a blade. She flinched at the sound of her name, her sobs catching in her throat. Slowly she lifted her head. Her face was a mess of tears and flour. The terror in her eyes was now mixed with something else. Defiance. "What is the meaning of this?" he demanded, the Duke in him rising to the surface, a cold armor of fury and command. "You were dead. I mourned you. Your children have been starving themselves for you." She pulled her children closer, her arms a protective shield. "I survived," she said, her voice raw. "No thanks to you." The words struck him like a physical blow. "What are you talking about? It was an accident. The bridge, the river." A bitter, broken laugh escaped her. "It was no accident, Alaric. The carriage bolt was deliberately loosened. The driver was paid to take the old bridge in a storm. I was meant to die." His mind reeled. It was impossible. A fiction. Who would do such a thing? Why? "You're not making sense. You were delirious, injured." I was perfectly clear, she bit out, her gaze hard as flint. I crawled from that river. I saw the driver speaking to a man on horseback, taking a purse of coins. I knew if I went back to the manor, whoever wanted me dead would simply try again, and I knew. She paused, her voice dropping to a whisper of pure venom, that you would not believe me. Not believe you? Eleanor, I am your husband. You are your mother's son, she corrected, and the accusation in those words was colder than any river. You have always been your mother's son first. She never wanted me here. She never wanted me to be your duchess. She saw me as an obstacle. Did you ever once stand up to her for my sake? Did you ever once question her little manipulations, her quiet poisons? He stared at her, the scenes she described playing out in his memory. Isolde's constant, subtle criticisms of Eleanor. Her suggestions that Eleanor was too fragile, too sensitive. Her insistence on managing the household, effectively usurping Eleanor's role. He had seen it as a mother's concern, a desire to help. He had told Eleanor she was imagining things, that she was being uncharitable. He had not believed her. The realization hit him with the force of a physical impact. She was right. He would not have believed her. He would have listened to his mother's calm, rational explanations and dismissed Eleanor's story as hysteria born of trauma. He looked from his wife's ravaged face to the children clinging to her. Their faces were buried in her neck, but he could see Julian's small hand reach up and take a piece of the warm bread from the cooling rack. He broke it in two and pressed a piece into his sister's hand, and then they began to eat. They ate the bread greedily, desperately, as if it were life itself. The sight broke him. It shattered the cold armor of his ducal pride and left him exposed and raw. All his power, all his wealth had been useless, but this woman, his wife, whom he had thought dead, had saved them with nothing more than flour, water, and a memory of home. He sank to his knees. The shards of the broken glass crunched under his weight, but he didn't feel them. He was on the same level as her now, a supplicant on the stone floor of his own kitchen. "Eleanor," he began, his voice cracking, but he had no words. What could he say? "I'm sorry," was a meaningless insult. "I didn't know," was a confession of his own blindness, his own unforgivable failure. She watched him, her expression unreadable. The fire of her anger seemed to have burned down, leaving behind only the cold ashes of exhaustion. "Leave us," she said, her voice flat. "Just for a little while. Let me have this. Let me have my children." He wanted to argue. He wanted to demand answers. He wanted to drag her from the floor and hold her until the world righted itself. But he saw the look in her eyes, the look of a cornered animal protecting its young. And he saw the truth. In this moment, he was the threat. Slowly, stiffly, Alaric pushed himself to his feet. He looked one last time at the scene. His wife, alive, his children, eating. The warm, life-giving scent of bread filling the cold, dead house. It was a world turned upside down, or perhaps for the first time in a very long time, it was a world finally turning right side up. He backed out of the kitchen, pulling the door closed, leaving them in the warm, fragrant sanctuary she had created. He stood alone in the cold corridor, the silence of the manor pressing in on him once more. But it was a different silence now. It was not the silence of the grave. It was the silence of judgment. His mother. The thought was a shard of ice in his gut. He turned and walked, not to his study, but towards the Dowager Duchess's apartments. For the first time in his life, he was going to question his mother, and he was going to get answers. Eleanor listened to the Duke's retreating footsteps, her entire body trembling with the aftermath of the confrontation. The children were still pressed against her, their small bodies warm and solid. Real. She could feel the crumbs of bread on their cheeks, smell the yeasty scent on their breath. She buried her face in Julian's hair, inhaling the sweet, familiar scent of her son. The 6 months of hell, of cold and hunger and terror dissolved in that single moment. They were here, they were safe, they were hers. She remembered the crash, the sickening lurch as the carriage tilted, the splintering of wood, and the icy shock of the river. The current had been a monster, pulling her down, tumbling her over rocks until her lungs burned and her head slammed against something hard. By some miracle, she had washed up in a tangle of roots downstream, bruised, battered, and freezing, but alive. As she lay there, gasping on the muddy bank, she had seen it. The carriage driver, her driver, meeting a rider on the far bank. A purse exchanged hands. The rider had worn the dowager's livery. In that moment, everything had become brutally clear. The accidents that had plagued her for the past year, the saddle girth that had mysteriously come loose, the bottle of laudanum by her bedside that was far stronger than the apothecary had claimed, Isolde's cloying concern, her constant presence, her suffocating web of control. Alaric, bless his noble, blind heart, had seen none of it. He saw only his devoted mother. She knew then that to return to Blackwood Manor was to return to her own murder. Alaric would not believe her story, not against his mother. She would be declared hysterical, mad from her ordeal, and Isolde would finish the job quietly, perhaps with a doctor who was too willing to prescribe rest and ever-increasing doses of sedatives. So she had run. She had pawned the one thing of value she had managed to keep, the sapphire pendant Alaric had given her on their wedding day. The money had been enough to buy passage on a mail coach to get her far away, to a small village where no one knew the Duchess of Blackwood. She became Ellen, a widow who had lost everything. She took a job as a scullery maid, her soft hands quickly becoming calloused and raw. She slept in a cold attic room and ate scraps, hoarding every penny. Her only link to her old life was her mother's recipe book, a worn, leather-bound volume she had tucked into her bag out of pure instinct before that final, fateful journey. The loneliness had been a physical pain, a constant ache for her children. She had devoured any news from the north, her heart stopping every time she saw the name Blackwood in a society paper. She learned of her own death. She read the flowery, false eulogies, and then she read the more worrying whispers of the Duke's withdrawal, of the twins' strange, wasting illness. That was when her plan had formed, a desperate, insane gamble. She could not return as Eleanor. But the position of cook at Blackwood had been advertised for months, a new one every few weeks. No one could please the master or the children. She knew what they needed, not fancy sauces or elaborate pastries. They needed the bread she used to bake for them on the nursery hearth, the bread whose recipe was in her mother's book, the bread that smelled of home. And now, here she was, back in the belly of the beast. But she was no longer the soft, pliable girl who had entered this house as a bride. The world had stripped her bare, and she had found a core of steel she never knew she possessed. "More, Mama," Elara mumbled against her shoulder, holding out a small, crumb-covered hand. Eleanor's heart clenched. She looked at the cooling loaves. It was more than bread. It was a weapon. It was proof. It was the key to this gilded cage. She broke off another piece and gave it to her daughter. "Yes, my love," she whispered, kissing Elara's forehead. "As much as you want." She held them tight, listening to the quiet sounds of them eating. For the first time in 6 months, she felt a flicker of something that was not fear or despair. It was hope, a fierce, dangerous, and utterly consuming hope. Alaric found his mother in her private sitting room. It was a symphony of silk and gilt, a room that always felt airless and overwrought. Isolde sat by the fire, engaged in her needlepoint, the very picture of serene, aristocratic grace. She looked up as he entered, a perfectly sculpted smile on her lips. "Alaric, darling, I was just thinking of you. Mrs. Gable tells me you have hired another cook. One can only pray this one is not a complete incompetent." He closed the door behind him, the click of the latch unnaturally loud in the quiet room. He walked to the center of the room and stood there, looking down at her. He saw her now not as his mother but as a stranger, a beautifully dressed viper. "The new cook," he said, his voice dangerously level, "is Eleanor." The needle stopped. For a fraction of a second, the mask of composure slipped. He saw a flicker of pure, unadulterated panic in her eyes. It was there, and then it was gone, replaced by a look of profound, pitying concern. "Oh, my poor boy," she said, setting her needlepoint aside. She rose and came toward him, her hands outstretched. "The grief has finally broken you. You are seeing ghosts. We must send for the doctor." He did not move. He let her come to him, let her place her cool, dry hands on his arms. He looked into the eyes that had feigned sympathy for him for 6 long months. "I am not grieving, Mother, and I am not mad. She is downstairs, in the kitchen. The children are with her. They are eating her bread." Isolde's hands tightened on his arms. "This is madness, some village woman who bears a passing resemblance. Alaric, you must get a hold of yourself. Eleanor is gone. It is a tragedy, but it is the truth. We have the death certificate. We have the witness." "Ah, yes, the witness," Alaric said, his voice dropping lower. "The man you paid on the riverbank, and the death certificate, from a parish 100 miles away, signed by a doctor who, I imagine, is a dear friend of yours. How very thorough you were." His mother's face went pale. She snatched her hands back as if he had burned her. "You dare!" she hissed, all pretense of concern vanishing, replaced by the venom Eleanor had described. "You dare accuse me, your own mother, after all I have done for you, for this family. I held this house together while you wallowed in your misery. I managed everything." "Yes," Alaric said, the word like a stone. "You did. You managed it all. You managed the loose bolt on the carriage. You managed the driver. You managed the lie. You tried to murder my wife. She was not fit to be a duchess," Isolde shrieked, her carefully constructed facade shattering completely. "She was weak, sentimental. She was turning you against me. She was filling your head with nonsense and your house with the smell of a common bakery. She had to be removed, for the good of the family, for the good of the name." The confession, so raw and hateful, hung in the air between them. Alaric felt a cold, calm clarity settle over him. The confusion and shock were gone, replaced by a purpose as hard and sharp as diamond. He had been a fool, a blind, trusting, arrogant fool. He had stood by and watched this woman poison his life, and he had called it love. "You will not speak to her," he said, his voice utterly devoid of emotion. "You will not go near her or the children. You will remain in these rooms until I decide what is to be done with you." "You cannot do this," she spat. "I am the Dowager Duchess of Blackwood." "You are a woman who attempted to murder my wife and who stood by and watched her own grandchildren starve," he replied, his gaze unwavering. "Your title is a courtesy I am no longer inclined to extend. You are a prisoner in this house, mother, and you should pray that is all you ever are." He turned his back on her, the sound of her enraged sputtering fading as he walked away. He left her there, in her gilded cage, finally seeing the bars that had been there all along. He did not go back to the kitchen. Eleanor had asked for time, and he would give it to her. He went instead to his study, and for the first time in 6 months did not reach for the brandy. He sat at his desk, pulled out a fresh sheet of paper, and began to write. He wrote to a man in London, a private investigator known for his discretion and his tenacity. He had lived in a world of lies. Now he would uncover every last piece of the truth, not just for himself, but for Eleanor. It was the only penance he could offer. For 3 days, the house existed in a strange state of limbo. Alaric confined his mother to her rooms, with a trusted footman posted outside her door. He took his meals in his study, simple trays brought by a nervous Mrs. Gable. He did not see Eleanor, and he did not see the children, but he knew they were together. The silence of the house had been replaced by new sounds, the distant, happy shrieks of children playing in the nursery, the smell of baking, not just bread, but pies and cakes and roasted meats. The house was coming alive again, but it was a life from which he was excluded. He was a ghost in his own home, haunting the periphery of the warmth his wife had brought back with her. He spent his time with his investigators' preliminary reports. The man was swift. The driver of the carriage was found, living well above his means in a northern port town. He confessed quickly when faced with the Duke's wrath, implicating the Dowager's man of affairs. The doctor who had signed the death certificate was indeed an old acquaintance of Isolde's, a man with significant gambling debts. The web of deceit was unraveling with sickening speed. Each new fact was another stone laid on the grave of the man Alaric had once been. On the 4th morning, he could bear it no longer. He went to the kitchens. Eleanor was there, showing Ilara how to shell peas into a large ceramic bowl. Julian was sitting at the massive kitchen table, meticulously drawing a picture with a piece of charcoal on a scrap of parchment. They were all dressed in simple clothes. The room was warm and bright. It was a picture of domestic peace, a world away from the stiff, formal life they had once led. They all looked up as he entered. The children's faces were fuller, their eyes bright. The haunted, starved look was gone. Eleanor's expression was neutral, guarded. "Your Grace," she said, her voice cool. She was the cook addressing the master of the house. The formality was a wall, thick and high. It hurt more than any shouted accusation could have. "Eleanor, please," he said, his voice low. He held out a sheaf of papers. "This is what I have found. The driver's confession, the records of payment from my mother's accounts, the proof of the forged certificate." She did not take the papers. She wiped her hands on her apron and looked at him, her blue eyes searching his face. "And what do you intend to do with this proof?" "Whatever you wish," he said, and he meant it. "If you want her prosecuted, I will see her in the dock. If you want her exiled, I will put her on the first boat to the continent. Her life is in your hands, as yours was in hers." She was silent for a long moment, her gaze dropping to the children. Julian was still drawing. He was drawing a picture of a smiling woman with two small figures beside her, standing in front of a house from which a chimney poured curling smoke. "I do not want revenge," she said finally, her voice softer than he had heard it yet. "Revenge is a poison. I have had enough of poison to last a lifetime. I want her gone. I want to never see her face again. I want her to have no power, no influence, no part in the lives of my children. It will be done," he promised. "She will be sent to a remote estate in Wales. Her accounts will be frozen. She will live out her days in isolation." "Good," Eleanor said simply. An awkward silence fell between them. The children seemed oblivious, lost in their own small, peaceful world. Alaric felt the vast gulf that separated him from that world. He had been the Duke of Blackwood, the master of all he surveyed. Now he was a stranger, begging for scraps from the kitchen table. "The children," he began, his voice thick, "they look, well, they are eating," she said. "They are healing. Because of you." "They needed their mother," she stated, as if it were the simplest fact in the world. He took a step closer. "And I," he said, his voice barely a whisper, "needed my wife. I was a fool, Eleanor, blind and arrogant. I let my mother's influence poison our marriage. I failed to protect you. I failed to trust you. And in doing so, I failed everyone, myself, most of all." He laid the papers down on the table, next to Julian's drawing. "I cannot undo what has been done. I cannot give you back the 6 months you lost. I cannot erase the fear and the hardship you endured. All I can do is spend the rest of my life trying to atone for it." He looked at her, his heart in his eyes. "I am not asking for your forgiveness. I have not earned it. I am asking for a chance to try." Eleanor looked at the papers, then at her children, then back at him. The hard protective shell she had worn since her return seemed to soften, just a little. She saw not the powerful Duke, but a broken man, humbled and truly, deeply remorseful. "The children need their father too," she said quietly, "but the man they need is not the Duke of Blackwood. He is the man who will sit on the floor and build a tower of blocks. He is the man who will read them a story before bed, no matter how tired he is. He is the man who will listen." She picked up a peapod and split it with her thumb, her movements precise and calm. "That man is welcome here. The Duke can stay in his study." It was not forgiveness. It was not a reconciliation, but it was a door, left slightly ajar. It was more than he deserved. "Thank you," he said, his voice thick with unshed tears. He looked at Julian, who was now carefully shading in the roof of the house in his drawing. He knelt down beside his son's chair. "What are you drawing, Julian?" he asked softly. Julian looked up, his eyes, so like Eleanor's, regarding him with a child's frank curiosity. "It's us," he said. "Mama and Ilara and me. We're home." Alaric looked at the simple, heartfelt drawing. A smiling mother, happy children, a warm house, it was everything he had almost lost forever. He reached out a hesitant hand and placed it on his son's shoulder. The boy didn't flinch. He leaned into the touch, just slightly. It was a start. It was everything. The days that followed found a new rhythm. Isolde was removed from the manor, dispatched under guard to a remote, dreary estate in the Welsh mountains, her power and influence utterly broken. The house seemed to breathe a collective sigh of relief, the oppressive atmosphere lifting like a shroud. Alaric kept his promise. He shed the skin of the Duke within the walls of his own home. He began to spend his time not in the study with ledgers and maps, but in the nursery and the kitchens. He learned, with a humility that was entirely new to him, the art of being a father. He sat on the floor, his long legs folded awkwardly, as Julian directed the construction of elaborate block castles. He submitted to Ilara's imperious commands as she served him imaginary tea from a tiny porcelain set. He learned their routines, their favorite stories, the funny little quirks of their personalities that he had been too distant to notice before. Julian was serious and methodical. Ilara was fanciful and dramatic. They were two halves of a whole, and at their center was Eleanor. He did not push her. He gave her space, approaching her with the cautious respect of a man courting a skittish stranger. He found her in the gardens one afternoon, her hands deep in the soil of the herb patch. She was still dressed in her simple cook's clothes, though Mrs. Gable had tried to offer her the pick of her old wardrobe. Eleanor had refused. She was not ready to be the Duchess again. Perhaps she never would be. He stood a few feet away, not wanting to crowd her. "It's a fine day," he said, the words feeling foolish and inadequate. She looked up, shielding her eyes from the sun. "The time needs turning," she replied, her tone practical. "The last cook let it go to ruin." Everything was let go to ruin, he said quietly. She met his gaze, and for the first time, he saw not anger or neutrality, but a flicker of her old self, a hint of wry humor. It would seem so, Your Grace. Alaric, he corrected her gently. My name is Alaric. She gave a small, almost imperceptible nod and returned to her work. He stayed, not speaking, simply watching her. After a few minutes, he found a spare trowel and knelt in the dirt beside her, pulling up weeds. They worked in silence, the only sounds the chirping of birds and the soft scrape of metal against earth. It was the most comfortable they had been in each other's presence in years. He made the kitchen his dining room. He ate his meals at the great wooden table where Eleanor's children did their lessons, where flour was a constant dusting on the floor. He ate the simple, hearty food she prepared, each meal a testament to the life she had brought back into his house. He listened to the children's chatter, to Eleanor's patient answers, and he felt the ice around his heart continue to melt. One evening, after the children were asleep, he found her in the kitchen, staring into the dying embers of the hearth fire. The cooling loaves of the next day's bread sat on the rack, filling the room with their comforting scent. I found it, he said softly. He held out his hand. On his palm lay the sapphire pendant, its starburst clasp gleaming in the firelight. The investigator tracked it to a pawnshop in York. The shopkeeper remembered you. He said you were brave. Eleanor stared at the necklace. It was the last link to her old life, the one she had sacrificed for a new one. She reached out a hesitant finger and touched the cool surface of the stone. It was our wedding day, she whispered, remembering the feel of his hands fastening it around her neck. A lifetime ago. I was so proud, he said, his voice thick with memory, and so terrified. You were so beautiful, and I felt like a clumsy boy who had somehow tricked the most wonderful woman in the world into marrying him. She looked up at him, surprised by the confession. He had always seemed so confident, so assured. The remote, powerful Duke. I never knew that, she said. There was a great deal you never knew, he admitted, his gaze full of regret. I hid behind my title. I let my mother run my life, and our life, because it was easier than learning to be a husband, a partner. It was a coward's path, and it led us to ruin. He closed his hand around the pendant. I don't expect you to wear this again. Not as a symbol of that life, but I want you to have it. It belongs to you. You earned it 1,000 times over. He held it out to her. She looked at the necklace, then at his face, etched with a sorrow and a sincerity that was undeniable. Slowly, she took it from him. Her fingers brushed against his, and a jolt, a faint echo of the love they had once shared, passed between them. She did not put it on. She simply closed her hand around it, holding it tight. Thank you, Alaric, she said. Her use of his name was a gift, and they both knew it. A few weeks later, a letter arrived. It was from the steward of the Welsh estate, detailing the dowager's life. She was bitter, enraged, and utterly alone, her days spent pacing her rooms and writing furious, unsent letters. There was a small, cruel part of Alaric that felt a grim satisfaction. But mostly, he just felt a profound sadness for the woman who had let hate consume her so completely. He brought the letter to Eleanor. She read it, her face impassive. When she was done, she folded it neatly and handed it back to him. She made her choices, Eleanor said, and we are making ours. That evening, as he was about to retreat to his own lonely rooms, she stopped him. Alaric, she said. He turned. She was standing by the nursery door, a soft shawl wrapped around her shoulders. Would you read to them tonight? His heart leaped. It was the first time she had invited him into that sacred space, the world she had built with their children. Yes, he said, his voice husky. Of course. He followed her into the nursery. The twins were already tucked into their beds, their faces scrubbed clean, their hair damp from their bath. They looked like two small angels. Papa is going to read the story tonight, Eleanor announced softly. Ilara's eyes went wide. Julian sat up a little straighter. Alaric's hands trembled slightly as he picked up the book. It was a worn copy of a book of fairy tales. He sat in the chair between their beds, the one Eleanor usually occupied. He could smell her faint scent of herbs and soap on the worn velvet. He began to read. His voice was a little unsteady at first, but he soon found the rhythm of the story, a tale of a brave prince and a clever princess. He used different voices for the characters, just as he remembered Eleanor doing. He saw Ilara's mouth form a small O of delight. He saw Julian's serious expression relax into a small smile. Eleanor stood in the doorway, watching. She watched her husband, the Duke, humbled and changed, reading to their children with a tenderness he had never shown before. She watched her children, safe and loved, listening to their father's voice. In that quiet, lamplit room, she saw the future. Not a return to the past, but something new. Something stronger. Something forged in fire and built on a foundation of truth. When the story was over, the children were nearly asleep. Alaric gently closed the book. He leaned over and kissed Julian's forehead. "Good night, my son." Then he went to Ilara and tucked her blankets more snugly around her. "Good night, my little princess." He stood up and turned to face Eleanor. The look that passed between them was one of profound understanding. The anger was gone. The hurt was beginning to heal. "They love you," she whispered. "I will spend my life being worthy of that," he replied. She stepped forward, and for the first time since her return, she reached out and took his hand. Her hand was no longer the soft, smooth hand of a duchess. It was the hand of a survivor, strong and capable. It fit perfectly in his. "Come," she said, "let's go home." She did not lead him towards the kitchens. She led him out of the nursery and down the grand staircase towards the formal wing of the manor that had been silent for so long. She led him towards their rooms, the Duchess's rooms. The next morning, the staff of Blackwood Manor awoke to a miracle far greater than the return of the lost Duchess. They awoke to the sound of laughter. It came from the main dining room, where the Duke and Duchess sat at the great mahogany table, not at opposite ends, but side by side. Their children were with them, happily eating porridge and chattering away. Eleanor was not wearing a cook's dress. She wore a simple morning gown of blue silk, and around her neck, gleaming in the morning sun, was a sapphire pendant. She was no longer Ellen the cook or Eleanor the survivor. She was Eleanor Beaumont, the Duchess of Blackwood, but she was not the same woman who had held that title before. She was stronger, wiser, and she was the undisputed heart of that house. Alaric looked at his wife, at the love and forgiveness in her eyes, and he felt a sense of peace he had never known. He was no longer the blind duke, ruled by tradition and a manipulative mother. He was a husband and a father, a man who had walked through the fires of regret and emerged on the other side, humbled and whole. Outside, the sun shone on Blackwood Manor. Inside, the scent of fresh bread filled the air, a constant, fragrant promise of warmth, of life, and of a love that had been lost and found and was now, finally, home.